Welcome everybody. I'm really pleased that you've all joined us this evening, especially given the amazing weather that's outside. I was saying earlier, I think probably all of us would much prefer to be out and about instead of stuck on yet another Zoom meeting. So yeah, much appreciated. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Bell. I work for the National Trust on the Stepping Stones project, and I'm really pleased to be able to work with Debbie and others to support the Bumblebee survey this year. So before we get into introductions and sort of into the rest of the content, I just thought I would get the sort of Zoom notices out of the way, so just bear with me. The first thing to let you all know is that we are recording this evening. That's so that anyone who couldn't join us live will be able to watch the recording. So that will be made live on YouTube in the next few days. So if you don't want to appear in that recording, the easiest thing to do is just to turn your video off. And just be aware that if you do turn your video on or if you unmute yourselves and speak, then you will appear in the recording. So just a warning about that. I think by default you were all muted when you joined. If you have taken yourself off mute since, if you just check and pop yourself back on mute, that's just to cut out any sort of interference and background noise. And obviously, if you do want to unmute yourself to ask a question at any point, then that's absolutely fine. Sometimes as well, for those of you who aren't that familiar with Zoom, if your bandwidth isn't great, turning your video off can help with that as well. So if you are getting messages about your internet connection being unstable or anything like that, then just turn your video off and it often helps. There is a chat function in Zoom. I'm sure if you've used Zoom before, you'll be aware of that. I'm actually going to ask you not to use that if you can avoid it tonight. I personally find it incredibly distracting when you're trying to watch someone do a presentation on Zoom and there's messages popping up all the time on the chat. So obviously, if there's something that the speakers want to share, or if there's something really important and interesting that you want to share or stick a web link or something, then use it for that. But if we could keep it to an absolute minimum, that would be great. If you do want to ask a question of the speakers, either maybe at the end of their sessions, if we've got time, or at the Q&A session in the end, I'm going to ask you to use the raise hand function in Zoom. And if you haven't used that before, the easiest way to do that is across the bottom of your screen. You will hopefully see a menu with things like mute and stop video and things. You should have something there that says participants. If you click that, and you can sort of find yourself in that list. And if you hover over your name, there should be an option to raise your hand, and that just lets me know that you've got a question to ask. And then when you've asked the question, you can lower your hand, and then it doesn't appear like you still want to ask another question. And again, I can remind you about that later when we get to the Q&A session. Another thing about Zoom, if you haven't used it too much before, you have a choice of how you view your screen. So for instance, at the moment, I've got it on something called gallery view, which means I can see all your faces at the same time. But for the rest of the evening, it's probably a good idea to switch it to speaker view, and then you'll get sort of a bigger picture of the person giving the presentation at any one time. So you can find that in the top right of your screen. There should be some options and you can click between the different views. So yes, I recommend speaker view for the rest of the evening. We're aiming to end around 9 o'clock tonight. We are going to have a little break because I realise that an hour and a half is quite a long time to be on a Zoom meeting. So don't worry, there'll be a chance to nip to the loo or grab another cup of tea or anything about halfway through. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce the speakers now. So I think we'll just go in the order I can see them on my screen. So Debbie, if you want to unmute and just introduce yourself.
I think I am unmuted, aren't I? Hello, everybody. I'm Debbie. I moved to Shropshire in 2016 and came with a background of keeping honeybees. But having given up keeping them, I decided I'd turn my interest to bumblebees, which has brought me to this point here.
Great. Thanks, Debbie. Richard.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm Richard Gomont. I'm the Science Manager for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. I'm about an hour down the road in the Malverns and do an awful lot of stuff with recording and helping people to learn ID.
Thanks, Richard. And Jen?
So I was a master's student at Harper Adams, so a bit down the road as well, last year, and hopefully I was supposed to do the fieldwork for these bumblebees, but obviously that didn't happen. So I've just been helping with any queries and writing up the report, which I'm sure hopefully will be handed out soon, so you can all have a read of that.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, obviously Jen alluded to last year and obviously the events of last year. It's quite a strange meeting tonight because it was the equivalent event last year that was, I think, the last event that I attended for work, and I think that was the same for almost everyone else who was there. It was the last time we were gathered in a group. I think lockdown was announced. Was it the same night, Debbie, or the night after, or very soon after?
Yeah.
So it feels very strange that we've come full circle and we're back here again, hopefully with the prospect of getting out and about a bit more this summer and being able to do some more field work. Okay, so I think we'll get started now. So Richard's going to speak first, and he's really going to give us a bit of background about bumblebees in the UK in general and also in our local area. So if I hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Charlie. Just find the right bit to share. That should be coming through.
Yeah, perfect.
Good. So yeah, this is a bit of a general introduction to bumblebees, and then we'll zoom in a little bit on the relevant area. So bumblebees are not the only bees in Britain. There are up to about 280 species, depending on whether you count extinct species or not. Only one of them is the honeybee, which, as Debbie's already alluded to, is the one that's kept by beekeepers. It is generally not a wild bee in Britain, but it is pretty much everywhere. The bees that I'm particularly interested in, working for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, are the bumblebees. Funnily enough, there's 24 species of those in Britain, of which 18 do standard bumblebee things. They make nests and have workers and that kind of thing. There are also 6 parasitic species, which looked at all that foraging and thought that was a bit much like hard work. All of the rest are solitary bees. There's about 250-ish species in Britain. We are losing species. 20 species of solitary bee have gone extinct in Britain, but we're also recognising that we've got species we didn't know about before. So that number is both increasing and decreasing at the same time, just to cause a little bit of confusion. Bumblebees have an annual life cycle. So for most of the last 6 months, this has been the typical bumblebee tucked up in a little hole in the ground. In this case, she's in a plant pot. Soil, compost is nice and easy to dig through, but you'll find them underneath stones and in old rotten logs and that kind of thing. And at the moment, slightly later than normal because it's been a very late, very cold spring this year, the queen bumblebees are coming out and desperately searching for food. During the course of that period, they will wander quite a long distance from where you might expect to see them. And so things like the Bilby Bumblebee turn up potentially quite a long way away from some of the moorlands. So this is the sort of time where the Edale Garden Centre is a very good spot to try and see the Bilby Bumblebee, for instance, even though it is not up on the moors themselves and it's not got bilberry there. You won't see them there later in the year, but they do wander at this time of year because they're trying to find where the food is. Before too much longer, the bees will be starting to build their own nests. I saw my first worker bumblebees on Friday last week. This is your typical bumblebee nest. These little white C-shaped things in here are Bumblebee Grubs. They are the caterpillar stage, essentially. These, if you can just about see somewhere, that wasn't pointing on, there we go. Little white grains of rice in here are actually bumblebee eggs, tiny little things. And you can see bumblebees don't have the same slightly OCD nesting arrangements that honeybees do. It's a much more laissez-faire attitude to nest building. They build a collection of little pots and sticking to each other, sticking to bits of the nest just as and when they need them. And each of those will either have larvae in or have nectar in or have pollen in. The queen bumblebee is the only one who survives the winter. She will go out and forage, and she's the only one who can forage until she rears that first batch of worker bumblebees, worker bumblebees are the only ones that actually go out and do that foraging role as pretty much the only thing that they do, and they replace the queen in that role. She stays in the nest where it's a bit less dangerous, and if she produces enough workers, eventually towards the end of the season, it says late summer there, and for most bumblebees it is, you start producing the new reproductive generation. But for the real spring specialists, things like the early bumblebee and the tree bumblebee, you'll start seeing the males probably in a few weeks, possibly slightly later this year. But they're produced at the end of the bumblebee colony life cycle. But some of those colony life cycles are really quite quick, and they'll have 2 or even 3 generations a year. That has proved a bit of a problem for bumblebees over the last 100 or 200 years, because it's a very intensive lifestyle. They need an awful lot of food to keep a nest going, and there aren't very many reproductive individuals in that nest. So a typical bumblebee nest might have 100 sterile workers, but only 1 breeding queen in that nest. So that's an awful lot of mouths to feed for a comparatively small breeding population when you compare that to something like butterflies, where every adult is a potential breeding individual. And because bumblebees are only feeding on flowers, there's a lot less in any environment that they can actually feed on. Again, when you compare to things like butterflies, where the adults might feed on flowers, but the larvae feed on the leaves. There's an awful lot more leaf to the average plant than there is pollen or nectar. So bumblebees tend to suffer first when the quality of the wider countryside declines, when there are fewer flowers in it. Bumblebees tend to be the ones that you lose first from that sort of environment. And this 1980 atlas was the first real standardized distribution map of where bees were in Britain, bumblebees in particular. And that found that over 1/3 of our social bumblebee species, so 7 species, have declined by more than 70%, which is extinction level population dynamics, that is circling the drain. We actually lost 2 species during the 20th century. 8 of the remaining 24 are listed as rare. Even the government has noticed how rare they are. And that includes these 3 red species, all of which are found fairly local to the Stiperstones area. The Bilby Bumblebee I've already mentioned, but you've also got both the moss carder and the brown-banded carder, which we're going to go into a little bit more detail on next week. So the Bilby Bumblebee, Bombus monticola, is very much a northern and western species in general. This is a distribution map of all time, so overestimates the current distribution, but it does have very clearly this upland distribution in England particularly, and it is around here. If we zoom in and see the records, you can see that the Stiperstones region and the Long Mynd in general is a really, really big hotspot for it. You can see this cluster of records and another one here. There are almost as many records within this circle as there are outside it in that picture. It's a real hotspot for the species, but we need more to know how it's doing now. This is a period of quite intense change for our upland species in general, with both climate change and habitat change, and we want to know a little bit more about what is actually going on with these really quite highly threatened species. And that was it for me, ending on a high note.
Great, thanks Richard, really set the scene.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Great, so I think just because of the time, we will do questions at the end all at once. So if we move on now to Debbie. Now, Debbie, for those of you who don't know, is really the driving force behind this whole project. And it's thanks to Debbie that we're sort of doing this and that we're all here this evening. So Debbie's going to just go into the history of the project, I suppose, and go over what happened last year and what was planned and sort of what ended up being able to be possible due to COVID. So over to you, Debbie.
Okay, well, thank you first everyone for coming tonight. I think you'll probably all recognise when you become passionate about something, it becomes something you just can't put down, you can't ignore, and I think that is what has happened to me over the last year. I'm just going to share the screen of the slides that I'm going to do. There we go. So I moved to Shropshire, as I said, in 2016. I was a beekeeper. I was aware of the Bilberry Bumblebee from having holidays in Shropshire and probably had spotted one once or twice. It's a particularly beautiful bee. I heard someone gasp when the first picture went up that you showed, Richard.
Debbie, sorry to interrupt. We can't actually see what you're sharing.
Oh, can you not?
It says that you've started screen sharing, but I think you need to click on the sort of PowerPoint.
Oh, what have I done wrong, Charlie?
If
Do you want to put them up?
Well, just if you stop sharing and then if you try again, if you do screen share, and then you should get a picture of all the files that you've got open on your computer. And if you click your PowerPoint.
Can you see it now? No. Oh.
No. Do you want me to
I think you might have to share the one I sent you. It's saying it's paused, but it won't start the resume. Sorry, everybody.
No.
Just as well I sent them to you, Charlie. Okay. You.
Let's give it a go.
Okay, are we there?
Yeah, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Cool, lovely. I will start again. So as I say, I moved to Shropshire in 2016. I had holidayed here and I think I'd been lucky enough to spot the odd Bilberry Bumblebee. So I was aware of it. It is a particularly beautiful bee. I'll go back to someone gasping when they first saw the picture. It amuses me slightly that Dave Golson, who was the original founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, his original logo for the trust was based on the Bilberry Bumblebee. And he writes about it quite amusingly in his books, if you ever read one of his books. The Bilberry Bumblebee is a specialist, and I guess that's one of the reasons it's a rarer bee. It does depend on bilberry plant, although as Richard has also said, it needs to be able to forage beyond that. It's a mountain specialist, so monticola is referring to its mountain habitat. So it's something that can be locally common, but nationally much rarer. So next slide, Charlie. So I kept honeybees, as I said, for 1 year, 24 times. And the reason I say that is every year it changes. And I think, you know, it sort of is the same case with with bumblebees as well. There was a memorable day on the 3rd of July 2019, and that is the actual photograph I took when I noticed there were quite a number of Bilberry bumblebees congregated together. They were on white clover. That was quite well grazed. It didn't look like it really should be a very popular plant and offering a great deal of nectar. The thought process that set off in my mind was, this is a foraging gap. So I recognised it from honeybees, where the first flush of the spring flowers has passed, and you know the bees are then really waiting for the summer flowers to come in. And it seemed to me that these bees were sort of scraping the barrel a bit, trying to find somewhere to feed. So as a result of that, I came off the Mind and very bravely went and knocked on the door of the National Trust. I can't remember who I met that day, but I certainly came into contact with Peter Carty soon afterwards. And I just said, well, you've got this beautiful bee, what are you doing about it? And they were aware of it, of course, but I think it hadn't really been flagged up as a priority species. And I guess that's why when I said, so can I do a project with you, there was an answer was yes, which, you know, was lovely to hear. And then I thought, goodness, what have I taken on? Okay, so next slide. The other part of this project coming about was the contact with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I made contact with them and then had a phone call from a wonderful man called Rodri, who I can see is watching tonight. I think we probably talked for between an hour and a half about bumblebees. And I came away feeling very, very supported. I went to the Bumblebee Trust Agm, and it was the best AGM I've ever been to. So if any of you are thinking of a new charity to get involved with, I can't recommend it highly enough. Okay, next slide. So I think particularly given with what's happened last year, one of the things I want to do is to become a good ancestor, to leave behind something that is going to help the world be better, to connect young with the nature, which is my background in teaching, and also to focus on something that's literally on my doorstep. So that was really how the Bumblebees on the Mind came about, and it wouldn't have really appeared without the National Trust and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust sort of giving their overwhelming support, and then later Charlie joining in with the Stepping Stones project. So that's how we got to this point. So next slide, please. I like to think actually 2020 rather saved me. I know for a lot of people it was a difficult year, but I'd marched into the National Trust terribly over-ambitious with a whole range of projects that I was going to deliver on all by myself during 2020. And probably looking back, that was massively over-ambitious. But I had managed to persuade Jill Perkins, who's the CEO of the Bumblebee Trust, to come along to Cardingmill Valley. She launched the project, a small group of us, because the world was changing very rapidly at that point. And when everything changed and we realised that we were going to have to rethink what we were doing, I think at one point I thought, well, that's it, we're all going to stay indoors and nothing can happen. But as I became more optimistic, I realised, people can go in their gardens, and people later on were allowed to go out for exercise, and it seemed to me there were some possibilities. So what rose out of it was a project called Bilberry Bumblebee in Your Garden that was trying to answer the question of where does this bee go during the foraging gap. And the other part of it was to divide up the Long Mind into 1 kilometre grid squares, allocate it to volunteers to go and do some detailed studies there, walk up as regularly as they can and record any bilberry bumblebees that they found. We were very lucky because the people doing these projects had more time in 2020. They probably had more time to focus, and of course the weather was absolutely amazing. So we were gifted quite a few really lovely things last year. Next slide, please. So Stepping Stones also was, Charlie had literally started her job, I think, pretty much the day we launched. So it was all very new, but she climbed on board very quickly and became, the person supporting the project. In the gardens of the Strattons, we had a lot of enthusiastic volunteers who sent in photographs. The project was focused on trying to find the Bilberry Bumblebee last year, and of course the difficulty with that is a lot of the sightings were not that particular bee, so it can have a negative effect on the people sending them in. So we've recognised that, and I hope you'll see we've changed how we're going to do it this year. But of the photographs we got, we managed to identify 5 out of our 8 common bumblebees in people's gardens, and one lady sent in a video clip of a foraging bee, and I'm fairly certain that was a Bilberry Bumblebee in Old Stretton, which is not too far from Ginlye Meadow, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, next slide, please. So Ginlye Meadow is a National Trust owned meadow. It covers several acres, and it is truly beautiful in the summertime, and it has a wonderful variety of flowers. It wasn't the focus of the study that we were doing, but of course I couldn't resist going up, and I met a few other people up there a couple of times later to see whether the Bilberry Bumblebee was using it. And delighted to say that we did find 10 individuals. They were foraging on bird's foot trefoil and white clover in the meadows, and it sort of answered the question and also emphasised that there is a foraging gap. The bilberry isn't in flower all through the season, and that these meadows are part of the success of this species, certainly now, and also the part that we can play going into the future. So it's absolutely wonderful that the National Trust have this meadow, and hopefully we'll have many more in the future in order to support this bee. Okay, and the next slide. So the kilometre square study was really requiring people with a higher level of survey skills. I haven't met most of them. It was mostly done through email. I hope some of you are listening tonight. But I had a lovely team of 6 people who obviously were experienced in surveying other animals. But they rose to the challenge. They learnt about their bumblebees. They used their methods of using nets and pots to be able to get a closer look so we could get good photographs of them. And we covered 13 different 1 kilometre grid squares on the Mind between the end of May and the beginning of August. This lovely graphic was done by Jen, who we'll talk to in just a moment, but it was based on how we did the monitoring. It's quite tricky and you have to get used to watching Bilberry bumblebees. They're very, very busy bees, so they disappear very quickly and quite hard to keep your eye on them. And the other challenge is that bilberry flowers hang downwards and are often inside the bush, so the bee will dive down into the bush and then it's vanished. So you do have to learn to follow the sound of the bee. So that's where this graphic is showing you that you stop and then you listen for the sound of the bee. It's a medium-sized to small bee, so the pitch of the bumblebee buzz is a little higher than the big queens that you've been seeing over the last few weeks. And once you've listened, you can then actually start pinpointing where the bee is in the bush and locate it. And then what the surveyors were doing was having to then net the bee and look at it in order to get a confirmation photograph and also take a location. I've posted most of my records on iRecord, which also requires an OS reference number so that it can really pinpoint where these bees have been found. And later on that helps people like Richard when they're looking at distribution maps to sort of very carefully pinpoint where these bees are. So what we were aiming to do is to get a distribution picture of this bumblebee on the Long Mind during 2020. And so I will pass over to Jenny now, who hopefully will tell us what we achieved.
So I just had to find the unmute button. Hi, so am I on the screen? Oh. Okay, so yes, so I'm Jen, obviously. I have written the report, so hopefully I've understood the wonderful work that all the volunteers have done. I'm definitely very jealous of all of you and Debbie that could go up onto the Mind, because I've been stuck at the other end of the country for most of the summer. So I'll just talk to you about these 2 maps that we've got. So this one obviously is got the historical records of the Bilberry bumblebees on the Long Mind, which I think probably is kind of the kickstart for Debbie's interest and why the National Trust picked it up, because obviously you can see it's covering quite a bit of the Stretton Hills and especially across the Long Mind. And you've got where Church Stretton is, I don't know if you can highlight that, that's actually come into like the residential areas, maybe some gardens. So that was quite interesting that you showed the results from the Bumblebee in Your Garden project, because we actually had, we had one in All Stretton, which was quite nice. So I guess it kind of shows if you've got a well-stocked garden and you're close to the Chinland Meadows, then they may well just come and you don't need to go anywhere, which is great if you're not so mobile or it's a bit windy day and you don't want to go up on top of the hill. So obviously the historical records are quite a broad kilometre square, so makes it a bit trickier to understand the precise distribution, but it's a nice broad overview of the general distribution on the Mind. And obviously it's across a few, I'm not sure quite how many years the data is spread across or how many bees are in each square, but it was a good, so with the 2020 data, we've made a nice baseline of the distribution for the first year across with a bit more standardized surveying. So that's really interesting to have a look at and kind of gives us a bit more of a background of where in future what we might want to look, or any future projects to get people interested in. And yeah, because it's still on the Longmynd and in a few similar areas that the historic records were in, that possibly suggests that we've been doing the right thing with the habitat management and acquiring ginland meadows. So that's always a good sign. Okay, don't have the next slide, please, Charlie. So then this map is just showing how specialist, as Debbie and Richard showed on their slides, that they really do like the upland heathlands. So they're all pretty much, yeah, they're all covered in the heather. But an interesting observation is that they won't be found on pure moorland. So you do need some bilberry present. So I think Debbie will be talking about the methods a bit later, but I think because we stuck to the bilberry makes you're able to find them a bit better. And it's quite interesting because we found a queen and a nest. So that's a nice indication that they're actually breeding on the Longmynd. They're not just coming from the Stiper Stones to have some lunch and then travelling back. So that's a nice future thing, because we can actually maybe increase the populations with the right habitat management, and then yeah, get more people interested in this. But they do also need the wildflower meadows. So especially Debbie mentioned white clover, but the queens tend to go on willow, like a lot of the other queen bumblebees that have been out at the moment, if you've noticed what they're feeding on. But they also quite like bird's foot trefoil, and there's a whole list in the report of plants that they will end up using. So if you've got any of those near you, or if you notice any when you're on your walks, might be interesting to just take a minute to sit and watch and see if anything comes onto the plants. They also, when it's been a particularly dry summer season, they might come onto the wet flush if there's no flowers you use on the heathland. So there's multiple areas you can look. If you've had enough of walking around dry heath, you could try the meadows or wet flush for a day and then switch between them. So I think, so we've got, yeah, hopefully these maps have sparked a bit of interest in this evening's talk, so you can maybe not right at the moment, but hopefully in the next month, a full bumblebee that I really want to come up and see next year.
Thank you, Jen. I think the maps show a good cover of the Bilberry Bumblebee on the Longmynd. And so what the project has shown for us is that they are there, they are present, they're over a wide area. To be honest, I would almost go as far to say as wherever there were bilberries, we were sighting Bilberry bumblebees. So that was a really good answer.
Good for conservation across the UK as well, or with Rodrigues pollinating the Peaks project too.
Yeah. So Charlie, this has led into some more work with the National Trust, I think. Where's Charlie gone?
Yeah, I'm here, I'm back. Sorry, I was desperately trying to find the unmute and start video button. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Debbie. So the Bilberry Bumblebee has become a real focal species for the work that I'm involved with the Stepping Stones project, and also the wider work that we're doing over the Longmynd and surrounding areas. So our ecologist, Andy Perry, who sends his apologies for tonight, but he's been doing a lot more investigation work into this species, and that's been a bit of a desk study on the existing reports and previous studies that exist, but also some mapping and modelling work as well. So I'm just going to present some of his findings, and this will hopefully be brought together into a species action plan for the Bilberry Bumblebee, specific to the Longmynd and Stiper Stones and the rest of the Stepping Stones area. So I will share my screen. Okay, so yeah, I mean, this is similar to the map that Jen's just shown, but this is showing the the sort of distribution of the Bilberry Bumblebee in the stepping stones area. So the red line is showing the area that my project is working over. So you can see down here we've got Church Stretton and the Long Mynd, and then over on the other side of the area, this is the sort of Stiper Stones Ridge. So that gives you a general feel for the project area. And you can see that both the sort of old record, so by old we're talking about pre-1990, the old records and the more modern records are very much concentrated on the Long Mynd and the Stiper Stones there. So this is that same data, but just looking at the density of records of Bilberry Bumblebee. So you can see that actually quite a lot of these 1 kilometre grid squares only have one record, and that's all the records that have ever been made, historical and more recent. So this pale yellow colour that you can see up here in these squares, and a few down here as well, that's only one record. So, you know, not really enough to know whether there's a sort of breeding population in that area, in that particular one kilometre square. And it's only really when you get into this core part of the Long Mynd that you can see those darker shades, and right on top of the Stiper Stones here, those darker shades just illustrating more records, essentially. So Andy had a look at those records in relation to the sort of existing network of semi-natural habitats in the project area. I think Jen's already alluded to this in terms of the heathland. But the habitats that we're looking at in Stepping Stones are heathland. Frith is another one, so that's that kind of upland fringe habitat that you often get on steep slopes where grassland is giving way to heathland. So it's characterised by things like gorse. And then we've got woodland, wetland, neutral grassland, so essentially meadows. And you can see that out of all those habitats, it's very definitely heathland and frith that have the vast majority of those Bilberry Bumblebee records. So again, as Jen said, it's very much a specialist of those upland habitats. So Andy did a bit of analysis to understand the habitat preferences of Bilberry Bumblebee, and he sort of broke those habitats down into a bit more detail. So you can see here there's an absolutely overwhelming preference for dwarf shrub heath. Again, that's no real surprise. So that's your habitat that you're going to have your heather and your bilberry in. And you can see that the other habitats that you find up on the Long Mynd are much less frequently used by Bilberry Bumblebee. So yeah, it's the dwarf shrub heath that is really their main source of forage during the summer. So there have been a few other studies on the Long Mynd in the past, especially by David Williams, and these really highlighted the importance of having that continuation of nectar source, as Debbie's already alluded to, that hunger gap between the bilberry and the heather. So it's so important that we try and avoid that and just make sure that there's something for these bees to eat from March and right through until the autumn. So you can see here in this table, this was the foraging sources used by Bilberry Bumblebee on the Long Mynd that David found in his surveys. So you can see that in the beginning of the year, it's actually willow and gorse, and then bilberry comes in throughout April, May, June, along with other things as well. So they will forage on things like rowan, broom, marsh thistle, hawthorn. You know, they will use those species if they're available to them. And then July, this is this hunger gap period really that Debbie alluded to, where it's so important that other flowers are around before the heather comes through in sort of August and September. And again, yeah, just interesting sort of joke by Jen about, you know, we don't want them just to be coming over to the Long Mynd for their lunch and then heading back to the Stiper Stones, but some analysis has actually been done about how far Bilberry Bumblebee will travel away from those core heathland habitats. And you can see that the answer really is not very much. They don't like travelling very far at all. So you can see this bar at the bottom that I think that just illustrates most of those records were made in heathland. But then, you know, the number of records drastically decreases the further you get from heathland. So to me, this illustrates the importance of having meadows and other sources of nectar as near as possible to heathland habitats. So getting that real mosaic of sort of meadows, sort of moving into the heathland without a big distance between them, because the Bilby bumblebees just aren't really going to travel over that intervening habitat. So this is a map that Andy's put together about Bilby Bumblebee in relation to altitude. So you've got the Stepping Stones project area shown there in red, and then the purple contour line within that is the 300-metre line. So you can see there that most of the records are within that upland area. The actual mean altitude value of a Bilby Bumblebee record was 407 metres, and the median was 433. So, you know, unsurprisingly, given that it is an upland specialist, it's adapted to cooler habitats. So 89% of the records were made above that 300 metres contour. He does note, though, that we did have one record down in the valley in someone's garden at 161 metres. So as we've already seen, they will move off those upland areas and forage in gardens in the valley bottom. So this is quite an interesting map as well. And for those of you who want to head out and maybe survey some areas where it might be really important to try and see if we've got Bilby Bumblebee or not, this is the map for you. So this map shows areas of upland dwarf shrub heath, so that really key habitat where we assume Bilby Bumblebee should be, but it hasn't been recorded yet. So those red areas are upland heath without any Bilby Bumblebee records. So these could be a real priority for further survey, and I'm happy to share this map to anyone who's interested. So you could maybe go out and target those red areas and see if we can expand the known distribution of Bilby Bumblebee within the area. And finally, this is again quite an interesting map. So Andy's been doing some habitat opportunity mapping, and I don't really have time to go into the full details of that. So if anyone's interested, drop me an email and I can expand on it. But this has been looking at areas that would be suitable for heath and where creation or restoration of heath would be most beneficial to complementing the existing habitat network of heath. So areas, for instance, that would expand the habitat patch size, or they might help with connectivity between existing habitat patches. So the darker shade of green, that's where heathland restoration or creation would be most beneficial for Bilby Bumblebee. So it would help those populations expand. And as I said, there's quite a lot of complex modelling behind this work that Andy's done that I sort of don't really want to go into now, but it might help, you know, in the future if we're looking for restoration opportunities and working with farmers and landowners to think about where we can create some heathland habitat. This map might be a really key resource to draw on when we're thinking about that. Okay, so that's it from me for that section. We're pretty much bang on time, which is brilliant. Thank you, everybody. We're just going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll be focusing on this year's survey. So obviously we've kind of set the scene up till now and talked about last year's survey. And when we come back, it'll all be about this year and how you can get involved and what you can do. So if we are back at 20 minutes past 8, if that's okay. So just a quick break, and then we'll see you in a few minutes.